Welcome to another explainer. Today we're doing a clinical teardown of the presidency of George W. Bush. We're going to examine exactly how a domestically focused governor was completely transformed into a wartime leader. Honestly, it's a fascinating study of how unforeseen crises can just totally rewrite a leader's legacy.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. Just listen to the sheer weight of those words. Spoken to a joint session of Congress shortly after the September 11th attacks, this single sentence absolutely set the stakes for a dramatically transformed presidency. In this explainer, we're going to dive right into exactly how that specific rhetoric reshaped American policy both at home and abroad.
So we'll map out this reconstruction in 6 quick parts: early life in Texas, the 2000 election, the post-9/11 pivot, framing the war on terror, domestic and global policy, and finally his post-presidency humanitarian efforts.
All right, Part 1, Early Life and Texas.
We really have to start at the foundation to understand his political worldview long before he reached the Oval Office. Born to a future president, sure, but Bush actually charted his own course, leaning heavily on private enterprise. He started with the Texas Air National Guard in 1968, and by the late 70s, he jumped into the oil industry, founding Arbusto Energy. But a major turning point happened in 1989 when he organized investors to buy the Texas Rangers baseball team. That move brought him statewide publicity and management experience, perfectly setting the stage for his 1994 gubernatorial run against the popular incumbent, Ann Richards.
Now, as governor, his flagship accomplishments were heavily domestic. He focused intensely on an education overhaul that added elements of choice and competition alongside comprehensive reading requirements. He also successfully championed tort reform to limit massive civil lawsuit payouts and instituted programs supporting faith-based initiatives. So the key takeaway here is that this specific mix, limiting government intrusion while pushing for social standards, became the exact blueprint for what he would later famously call his compassionate conservatism. Moving on to Part 2, the 2000 election controversy. Over 500,000. Think about that for a second. That number represents a massive paradox, because despite losing the nationwide popular vote to Vice President Al Gore by over 500,000 ballots, the entire race came down to a razor-thin margin in a single state, Florida. The weeks following Election Day were, well, chaotic, marked by intense litigation over recounts. Ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Bush v. Gore settled the matter, awarding Bush the exact 270 Electoral College votes he needed to win. This unprecedented legal intervention definitely secured his presidency, but it also meant he entered the White House facing a deeply polarized electorate and immediate questions about the mandate of his leadership.
Part 3, September 11 and the pivot.
That initial political environment we just talked about, completely shattered. Everything changes on September 11, 2001, effectively slicing his presidency into 2 distinct eras. As Bush himself noted, in a single morning the purpose of his presidency had grown clear. His administration was forced to instantly transition from a primary focus on domestic reform to defending the nation from external global threats.
In response to the deadliest attack on American soil, which claimed nearly 3,000 lives, Bush initiated a massive reorganization of the federal government. To rally the nation and establish a robust defense infrastructure, his administration created the Department of Homeland Security, the National Counterterrorism Center, and the position of Director of National Intelligence. The entire apparatus of the U.S. government was fundamentally realigned toward national security.
All right, Part 4, Framing the War on Terror.
Let's do a clinical rhetorical analysis of exactly how the president communicated this new reality. Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. Spoken on the very day of the attacks, notice what he's doing here. He identifies the United States inextricably with the core value of freedom. He doesn't just say buildings were attacked. He elevates the conflict immediately to a clash of fundamental ideals.
The mechanics of this speech rely on something called reification. By treating the abstract concept of freedom as a concrete entity that can be physically attacked, Bush made the enemy's target an American ideal. He created a stark moral contrast between the United States, identified with freedom, and the attackers, identified as faceless cowards.
A few days later, when asked about Osama bin Laden, Bush deliberately invoked a Wild West ethos. By stating he wanted the al-Qaeda leader dead or alive, he projected a rugged American resolve. He metaphorically communicated to the public that American steel and determination were far stronger than the physical buildings that had fallen.
But this framing had profound legal and strategic consequences. Critics noted that declaring war on an emotion, terror, made the enemy ephemeral and eternal. Interestingly, by 2005, some of Bush's top advisors actually attempted to shift the rhetoric to the struggle against violent extremism to focus more on diplomatic efforts. But Bush quickly overruled them, publicly insisting on the war on terror phrasing. Legal scholars suggest this was vital. Maintaining the war framing was necessary to justify broad, ongoing wartime privileges.
Part 5. Domestic Policy and Global Aid.
Let's look at how this rhetoric played out in actual policy. The war on terror materialized into the Bush Doctrine, targeting any hostile regimes harboring terrorists. This led directly to the 2001 war in Afghanistan, and later the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which was predicated on intelligence regarding weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. As these conflicts became protracted, particularly with the rise of intense sectarian violence in Iraq that necessitated the 2007 troop surge, these long, hard wars deeply impacted Bush's public approval ratings.
But here's the thing. Alongside that massive war effort, his administration was still pushing through sweeping domestic legislation. He enacted major economic overhauls with the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts, known as EGTRRA and JGTRRA. On a social level, he took a firm, aggressive stance against child exploitation, signing the Amber Alert system into law and enacting the Adam Walsh Child Protection Act, creating vital national registries to permanently safeguard vulnerable kids. Concurrently, he signed the Patriot Act to vastly expand surveillance and launched PEPFAR for global health.
And speaking of global health, $3.3 billion. That is a staggering number. Bush led efforts to fund the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. This represents a huge cornerstone of his later-term legacy, utilizing American resources for unprecedented global humanitarian aid, saving literally millions of lives, particularly in Africa.
Which brings us to Part 6, Post-Presidency Humanitarian Efforts. Leaving the Oval Office right amidst the immense challenges of the Great Recession in 2009, Bush shifted his focus away from a heavily polarized political landscape and back toward his roots in Texas. He published his memoir, Decision Points, in 2010. But most notably, he united with his predecessor and former political rival, Bill Clinton, to lead a major bipartisan fundraising effort for the victims of the devastating 2010 earthquake in Haiti. So as we look back at this technical reconstruction of his tenure, from the oil fields of Texas to the rubble of Ground Zero and the deserts of the Middle East, this is the vital question you should take away. George W. Bush's presidency shows us exactly how the words a leader chooses in a moment of crisis, like declaring a war on terror, don't just comfort a nation. They can permanently expand the powers of the office and alter the trajectory of the world. It really leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How will future crises reshape the leaders we elect to manage them? Keep that in mind as you analyze the leaders of today. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.